Some people may also be familiar with this as ED and I, DEI, or other terms which are broadly overlapping. When we talk about EDI, particularly in this presentation, it can become a little bit of a noun in its own right, and I'm sure there's a whole different presentation on that. But I just wanted to assure when we were using those acronyms, everyone was on the same page. We will be taking questions at the end. Please also feel free to use the chat function to ask us any burning questions you might have, and we can start with those when we get up, so you're also not having to remember what you were going to say throughout the whole presentation. Finally, before we begin properly, we have a question for everyone to start with, which will be on Mentimeter. So my colleague Leonie's just posted the link into the chat now. You can also go to menti.com with the ID code that's below. We ask you to fill in this question now and then maybe reflect on your answer throughout the session. We will be coming to the end if we have time. So I'll just give people a couple of minutes to access that before I continue. It's the same code, isn't it, Leonie?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
So.
Yeah, just checking as we also ran a session yesterday. So yeah, same code as the one yesterday. Lovely. While people access that, sorry, I clicked mute rather than the button I meant to. Yeah, so I'll get started with the presentation now. Obviously, please feel free to put in as much as little or as little as you want with that question. There are no wrong answers. It's just very interesting to reflect on the different perceptions and detail that people give us in regard to that question. And I'd encourage you to reflect on it as we go through our presentation today. So now on with the show. So I'd like to start with an introduction to both ourselves and the project. Today we will look at a particular aspect of our project, including the background, the rationale, and why the work has been approached in the way we have. We will go on to our recommendation. Oops, sorry, wrong thing there. We will go on to our recommendations, both in delivery, project design, and structure. So my name is David, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm the project manager of a piece of work that has been funded by the Greater Manchester ICP called Connected Care. We are joined today by Leonie, who will introduce herself in a minute as she takes us through the bulk of today's session. Leonie is the health educator on this project. Connected Care is a 12-month pilot project that was designed with two aims in the original brief. One is to pilot and create a model of EDI training and professional development opportunities to address key workforce diversity issues within cancer services. And the second was to work within the system in GM and other projects to advocate for and support the promotion of EDI in workforce planning and the delivery of education. These were the original aims, but as we hope to discuss in today's session, we want to discuss how this work has been delivered and how we've challenged some of these assumptions and taken a slightly different approach, one based on psychological theory and considering the equitable and ethical manner of delivering work in inequalities. So I'll continue now with the background and context. Just for those aware as well, I noticed in the chat that we did have unfortunately, the wrong question there. It's now been fixed. So for that Mentimeter, you should now be seeing the correct question. So apologies for that. So Connected Care began in September 2022, when Leonie and myself started in post following a slightly delayed recruitment period. The project originally planned to pilot training, and please note this is a word we'll be examining in this session, in a single cancer service with the aim of piloting it in this year to then build towards a future model that could be upscaled more widely. That service was going to be breast cancer. However, the stakeholders who were initially planned to be engaged unfortunately did not either have the capacity to support or the particular interest in the project, with some concerns around the nature of a 12-month piece of work that did not have a guaranteed future. We reflected on this initial rocky start and chose to widen our remit to staff in all cancer services in GM, working with stakeholders and partners to identify which groups to work with. This project is not specific to breast cancer or even cancer as a whole. We recognised it is around the model and delivering it to staff who can then evaluate it. So what have we done so far? This project has been developed in 4 stages: development, design, delivery, and dissemination or evaluation. The main focus has been the EDI programme, which Leonie will be talking about soon. Leonie has now engaged this programme with a huge range of staff in cancer roles, and we continue to deliver these sessions. This includes staff in primary care and secondary care, AHPs, nurses, and supportive roles across GM in multiple localities and NHS organisations. We have also piloted an engagement piece called Listen and Act at the Christie, which Leonie will discuss shortly, and how it ties into our design phase. We also collaborated with a number of different projects and teams, including consultancy for the School of Oncology and GM Cancer through some of their inequalities work, and supporting the recent Allies in Cancer Care project. The focus of this session, however, will be the design and delivery of the programme itself. This session operates on the same methodology as the work of our project, and we hope for it to both be collaborative and reflective. We ask you to consider what you hear today in relation not only to your own work and the spaces you work within, but also your identity within those spaces of work. After Leonie has spoken about the work we have done, I will come back in to reflect on our experience and some of our learning. So I will now hand over to Leonie, the health educator on our project, to discuss the main part of today's session from her experiences of delivering our project over the last 6 months. Thank you very much. Over to you, Leonie.
Thank you, David. Take a minute to make sure I've got. Thank you. So my name's Leonie Alexander, and I'm the EDI health educator on Connected Care project. So thinking back initially to those questions that we've just posed, I suppose for me, good EDI work comes from a place of compassion, and it has to align with my values built around social justice. So in this project, I really began by asking myself, how could this piece of work or intervention make the most impact? How can I stretch the boundaries to the fullest and ask what is possible? So we know that discrimination, inequality, racism is a significant problem in the NHS. Figures show that the introduction of the Workforce Race Equality Standard has led to some areas of improvement, but despite increased efforts to embed EDI throughout services, it's really failed to impact. Staff and patients feel unsupported and unsafe, and it's clear that policy, plans and targets do little to change workplace culture or attitude shifts that are so needed. NHS staff do have access to online mandatory EDI training. At best, this maybe provides learners with facts which lead to knowledge awareness, but at worst, it reinforces structural inequality by centering able-bodied cis hetero white identity and experience through its use of default identities which homogenize others. And the word training itself, as David said, has negative connotations. It positions learners as passive recipients of knowledge and facts, and it doesn't allow or support people to think differently, since it fails to centre the rich experience of individuals or invite people to understand that experience in relation to their clinical practice. So good EDI work, in fact, any learning or development should always be about listening. So on the screen, you'll see a quote from Carl Rogers, who is, many of you may know, is the founder of humanistic psychology and a person-centered approach. And this quote really communicates the ethos of the program I wanted to create. The first and most important step was to really listen and understand people's experience of inequality, both personal, professional, and from the perspective of service users, in order to build content that was really relevant and meaningful, rather than just generate generic information, which is obviously readily available online. So using principles of community and liberation psychology, I spent time talking to people in one-to-one interviews through snowballing usually, since we had very few contacts in the beginning, because neither of us had worked in cancer care. These interviews provided me with lots of rich qualitative data, and this combined with my ethnographic fieldwork, which included visiting clinics, observing what was happening on the ground to get a sense of pressures in real time, helped to build a picture And it was really clear that the programme not only needed to provide a space to think reflectively and critically, but that I needed to create a support system which could sustain the work. So I developed Listen and Act, which was a series of informal reflective sessions facilitated by me, someone just outside the trusts, to support people to come together, listen and share. The sessions were a form of participatory action research, so they not only offered insight into the issues people were experiencing, but more importantly, they aimed to empower people by supporting them to see the vital role that they play in improving workplace culture. The sessions were collaborative and led by participants' needs. People were invited to reflect upon EDI issues at work. In some sessions, people brought specific concerns to explore, but in other sessions, I introduced concept and ideas for discussion. So this framework really allowed people to feel the sessions were relevant to their experience and provided a neutral space to discuss openly. And these sessions were really pivotal to the development and the intended sustainability of the programme, because the sessions enabled me to develop relationships and build trust. And more importantly, it was unethical to begin work which opens people up to a new way of thinking and working if there is no system or community to support them to act. So the sessions and one-to-one interviews and my fieldwork directly informs the content of the programme, since it gave me a sense of what it was like for clinicians and service users. Again, something so important when thinking about developing any EDI work is to really hold back from jumping to solutions without really taking time to understand and accept issues, but also to respect people as experts of what works for them. You know, what do they need, rather than dictate what they should know. Again, that speaks to uninclusive, directive approach of learning that operates as a form of biopower to sort of maintain the status quo. So as you can see on screen, we have a snapshot of some responses from people. So 100% of people I spoke to said that they would welcome further opportunities for learning. And these quotes are from the pre-programme questionnaire. And we can see that the feedback kind of speaks to how unconfident people feel. Overwhelmingly, people revealed a sense of fear, lack of understanding, knowledge, confidence of saying the wrong thing. And equally, people communicated that they were unsure about where to signpost and maybe unsupported to even talk about or report issues. And alongside this, they also shared what they wanted and what they felt they needed. So this gave me the confidence to build a programme which draws on my psychological skills, a programme which centres people's experience by asking them to consider ways their personal and professional identities intersect. So this programme adopts a structural definition of inequality, underpinned by social psychological theory. The sessions utilise motivational interviewing and principles of compassion-focused therapy to produce a challenging, interactive programme which supports critical thinking and self-awareness in order to empower people to realise that they are part of the system and that they can make a difference. The first cohort of learners were consulted about the development at every stage, including the duration, the format, the timings. So it was truly a collaborative process. And each subsequent cohort has also been invited to attend an introductory meeting and complete an anonymous questionnaire which asks individuals to share their understanding and experience. The framework of the programme remains the same, but each session is unique because the content is reflexive and can adapt to the experience and needs of the learners in real time. We are now, I said yesterday at the 6 months, we are now at the 9-month stage of the programme. And as David said, a range of healthcare professionals have been collaborating and engaging with the programme, and the response so far has overwhelmingly been positive. and you can see some of those kind of percentages there that kind of speak for themselves. But, you know, rather than talk about this, I think I'd really like to share some of the anonymous feedback that we've got from the post-session surveys. I'll play that to you now.
Leonie, just to be aware, you haven't shared sound, so we're just seeing the images at the minute.
Okay, thank you. Oh, apologies, everybody. Sorry. Oh. Okay. Thank you. I'm just at this point going to unshare so that I can share with sound. Apologies. You'd think after all this presenting, I would have got the hang of that by now. Sorry, everyone. So yeah, apologies if that was tedious. There was music behind that, would have made it much more easy to digest. So yeah, moving on, hopefully there'll be sound now. So another really important part of the programme was about aftercare. So to try and offer opportunities to continue the work and the discussions. So everyone who's taken part in the programme has had the opportunity to attend a debrief several weeks after the sessions have finished, where they're invited to reflect on the ways the programme has had an impact on their clinical practice or personal, professional relationships since. And I'd like to share a reflection from one of the participants who gave their consent for me to share. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
I think everybody should have this training. I really do. After doing the training, I thought it was so thought-provoking. Like Louise said, you know, the
Sorry, everyone.
microaggressions, but also for me, some of the unconscious bias. Yeah, you automatically think of the sort of the top ones, like, you know, maybe race, gender, and some of the others. But for me as well, it was identifying some of the other ones that maybe I was making myself, like, you know, judging people maybe on age, you know, and things like that, you know, and assuming things. So I definitely think it should be rolled out right throughout the NHS and, well, and further essentially, but sort of initially definitely right throughout every single person who works in the NHS. I think from the cleaners right to the CEO. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you to that person who gave that feedback. I suppose at this point, before I hand back to David, it was important to say that whilst the feedback has been really incredible, there have been challenges. And thinking about the questions at the beginning, EDI work is relational, interpersonal, and structural. And I wanted this to be systemic, to not only build a program, but to try and build a community to sustain this needed change. But even communicating that and trying to build relationships was challenging. And there are many reasons for this, but often because people have very different perceptions of what EDI work is. And that's often dependent upon their experience of inequality and oppression, which forms their lens and perspective on how the work should be approached or done. And this connection or disconnection to experience and how it relates to decision making and clinical practice and behaviour is something I really ask people to explore in the programme. Throughout this project, as I said, I've asked myself what is possible and how can I push the boundaries. Although isolated and working fairly independently, the work had to connect the wider system. So building relationships in that completely new area and gaining trust to create an environment of psychological safety so that the programme could be a success. But coming into this project with no contacts or connections was obviously challenging because relationships take time to build. So whilst I benefited from that independence and relative autonomy through my status as an outsider, which allowed me to gain almost that trust and retain an objective perspective, I was limited in my ability to really embed the work because systems were often reluctant to support or collaborate. And this is likely due to many reasons: pressures, resources, time, but fear is certainly a factor and something we should be more open about. So when thinking about EDI projects and interventions, it's important not just to consider the intended impact of the project upon the system, but also consider what are the subsidiary effects and impacts the project creates purely through existing alongside, working within, and perhaps without the system. And lastly, I would ask you all to reconceptualize what sustainability is and it means in terms of EDI work. Whilst producing resources will always be an essential part of learning and dissemination, when it comes to this work, it's about culture and people. The programme aims to support and empower people to think differently. So it's necessary to move away from the notion of sustainability that's measured in physical production of resources or content towards a concept of sustainability that centres around people, impact, and the development of communities. It bringing together people through their shared commitment to meaningful change. In fact, spaces like this today. So I'll now hand back to David, who's going to talk through some of the challenges from a project management perspective.
Thank you very much, Leonie. So yeah, I'm going to be talking pretty much reflecting on what Leonie's just said there in terms of the delivery and kind of mirroring it with what we've encountered, particularly with the development and design of the project itself, to conclude today's session. So overall, Leonie and I believe that the project can be summarised as following. We're confident and proud of what we've been able to achieve, but as Leonie was just talking to there, it represents only a very small amount of the possibility and scope that this work could represent. There are four main areas I want to highlight in terms of the challenges from our design and delivery. So firstly, as I've mentioned at the beginning, we had to quite dramatically change scope during the design of the project, as some of the stakeholders who had been identified during the funding stage were not engaged with the project when it actually began. This meant that we did not have buy-in to clinical spaces from the start, not being clinicians ourselves, and as Leonie said, both being new to cancer. And we were having to cold call, so to speak, into these clinical spaces who were often not quite sure where we were coming from or who we were connected to. As I mentioned with that stakeholder who said that they were not sold on a 12-month pilot project with no guaranteed future doing anything meaningful, they also felt the work didn't tie into their priority areas from the start. That could have left us dead in the water, but in fact, it was a very useful challenge in terms of really strengthening that design. It made us consider from the very start our own position and the sustainability of the project, as I'll discuss in a moment. Secondly, there is a lot of EDI work going on in Greater Manchester at the minute at various different levels. Trusts all have their own EDI function, different professions all have their own EDI networks, and there are various projects tackling challenges in different disease pathways or with different marginalised communities. This is fantastic to see, and working in certain areas of unequal access is important. But overall, the current work seems quite disconnected with a lot of duplication and repetition. It's hard to ensure the work you're doing is truly bridging gaps and not running into other project areas. This also leads to a lot of projects feeling quite compartmentalised or isolated. This was our experience. There is extremely low capacity in the system at the minute for just having conversations or exploring possibilities. Often stakeholders want to be presented with immediate solutions, but as Leonie has spoken to, this often comes in the form of communicating and learning mutually and cooperatively. Often the most obvious answer is the one you should be careful of, and it takes time and people together to develop the right ideas. And finally, there's been a lot of difficult perceptions, as Leonie mentioned, in working within EDI that we've encountered. So these are some quotes and some ideas that we've encountered as we've been designing, developing this project and working with stakeholders. These are not necessarily bad things, or they're not coming from a place of prejudice, but they are difficult perceptions and challenges that we've had to encounter. Challenging these perceptions is an important aspect of this work. Conversations around EDI still centre it as an addition, something new, nice to have, or in addition to our current ways of working, rather than viewing it as work that needs to happen foundationally or systemically. There is often an artificial separation as well between inequalities as a broad topic and specific health inequalities. But more and more this project has challenged me if there is any distinction between those two areas, and indeed if thinking that there is a distinction could also be harmful. We have the language and understanding of EDI, but this is often done at a surface level and not throughout the work. So what would I do differently if I could go over again as the project manager to further support Leonie and the project with what we now know? Firstly, can we ensure that EDI and inequalities is considered from the very initiation and brief, rather than just as a nice to have? The work to be truly equitable, the concept of tackling inequalities needs to be built into the design phase of the project. As I hope our work has shown today, this doesn't just mean the outcomes of the project, but also in its delivery. How can a project be managed with the same connected principles that it applies? It's very easy to have good aims, but in the design, end up reinforcing inequalities. We all know the words co-production and co-design, but these can sometimes be applied in quite hierarchical, harming or colonial ways. We also talk about communities, but are we quite sure what that term means? How can we apply these principles at more than just the surface level? Secondly, how can we support the wider system within our smaller projects to shared aims? If we recall the question I asked earlier around what good work is in EDI, with a framework in place, system leaders and project managers can work together within that framework that exists to understand what is wanted to be achieved in the long term and how then to design activity to achieve it. We are very good at identifying problems and short-term fixes, but what is the long-term ideal that we're working towards? This way, disparate and different projects in different areas of the NHS can begin building together towards much easier collaboration. And then finally, when piloting work in inequalities, how much focus should be given on what's next? In our project, we have piloted and delivered the training, but future work would be dependent on additional funding, which does not give the capacity to start building something that's truly systemic. To what extent should equalities be owned within projects such as ours, or be part of that wider framework? We have been challenged on this project to deliver something sustainable, but with no guarantee of that being continued by ourselves. In our project, we may not see these sessions continue, but instead we are hoping that ensuring our outcomes are shared with decision makers, such as our collaboration with the School of Oncology, EDI leads, other project managers, or the education sector, will begin to support our shared vision, with our learning being useful with other work in the future. We hope our recommendations and experience will be beneficial towards building towards that change. Building communities of practice and developing a network of shared ideals will ensure this work is shared long after the project concludes. I mentioned that challenge at the beginning from a stakeholder, that pilot projects don't achieve anything and disappear. I'd like you to consider that in relation to why Leonie doesn't use the word training to describe our programme. Both during the project and beyond it, we hope the programme will impact the careers of the staff we've engaged with, but our learners will be supported into the our learning will support people into the far future. So thank you for your time today, and we'll now be taking questions. We'll also be hopefully putting on sessions in the future to deep dive into some of the topics we've touched on today. So I'll now hand over to Leonie, as I believe there's some questions that have already been posted into the chat. And feel free to also start using the hand function if you'd prefer to speak and discuss your questions. Thank you very much.